So I've got the iPhone 13 Pro in my hand right now. This is the graphite color, and wow, it's been 4 years since this thing came out. Can you believe that? 4 years. And you might be wondering, like, is this phone even relevant in late 2025? With the iPhone 17 Pro out there with its crazy triple 48 megapixel cameras and 8 times zoom, does this older guy still have a place? Or maybe you're using an older iPhone like an 11 or 12 and you're confused. You see the price of the 13 Pro dropping and you're thinking, should I just save my money and get this instead of the newest shiny iPhone? Well, in this video, I'm gonna be super honest with you. I've used this phone as my daily driver for 2 years. I skipped the 14 Pro, went to the 15 Pro, and now I'm daily driving the 17 Pro. But this 13 Pro has become my secondary phone, my backup, and my beta testing device. I'm gonna cover everything. The design, the surprisingly good performance on the new iOS 26 with that liquid glass aesthetic, the camera, and a bit of a, let's say, adventure I had with the battery recently. So if you're thinking about buying this, or you still have it and don't know if you should upgrade, stick around. This is the iPhone 13 Pro 4 years later. Okay, let's start with the design. Holding this in 2025, it still feels incredibly premium. You know, the 13 Pro uses these stainless steel rails. It's heavy, yeah, heavier than the titanium we get on the newer 15 and 16 Pros, but it feels dense, like expensive dense. The graphite color is still one of my favorites. It's just so stealthy. But we gotta talk about the port. Yeah, it's still lightning. I know. We've all moved to USB-C now, and having to keep a lightning cable around just for this phone is kinda annoying, honestly. It's the one real downside you notice immediately if you're used to the newer ecosystem. But other than that, the build has held up amazing. No squeaks, no bends. Apple really built these things like tanks back then. Now let's talk about the battery, because this is where things get interesting. So full disclosure, my battery health on this guy had dropped to like 71%, and let me tell you, at 71%, it really sucks. I mean, it was bad. I was charging this thing 2, maybe 3 times a day just to get through. The standby time was terrible. It was just draining so fast. So I decided to take matters into my own hands. I actually just replaced the battery myself. I didn't go to Apple. I bought an aftermarket battery from Cortex. It's this double power version. And you know what? It was actually pretty easy to replace. As you can see here, my battery health is back to 100%, but because it's not a genuine Apple part, I do get this little message in the settings saying it's an unknown part, but honestly, no problem. It doesn't affect usage at all. Since I swapped it, the phone is like reborn. It's back to normal. I'm getting a whole day of battery life again, just like when it was brand new. The performance is snappy again because the CPU isn't being throttled by a weak battery. So if you're buying one of these used or you still have yours, check that battery health. If it's low, a replacement, even a DIY one, makes this phone feel brand new. Alright, let's talk display and software. This was the first iPhone to get ProMotion, that 120Hz refresh rate, and honestly, that's the main reason this phone still feels relevant in 2025. If you go back to a 60Hz screen, you feel it immediately. But this, it's buttery smooth. And that brings me to software. I'm running the public stable release of iOS 26 on here. And you guys know with iOS 26, Apple introduced that new liquid glass style. The animations are just really satisfying, really fluid. I was actually worried. I thought, okay, this is a 4-year-old phone. This new heavy UI is gonna crush it. But surprisingly, it handles it really great. I really appreciate how Apple optimized iOS 26. It makes older software like iOS 18 feel kinda old. I don't know. There's a huge gap in design now, and once you get used to this liquid glass stuff, you don't want to go back. And the 13 Pro runs it without breaking a sweat. Speaking of not breaking a sweat, let's look at the raw performance. I ran Geekbench 6 on this recently. I got a 2426 on single core and 5995 on multi-core. What does that mean for you? Well, day-to-day, apps open quick. Swiping is smooth, but here's the secret sauce. RAM. The 13 Pro has 6 GB of RAM. I have a video on the base model iPhone 13, and that thing only has 4 GB, and it's constantly reloading apps in the background. It's annoying. But with 6 GB on the Pro, it's actually pretty good for today's standards. I mean, sure, the iPhone 15 Pro and 16 Pro have 8 gigs, and the new 17 Pro has that massive 12 GB. So there is a gap, but for most people, 6 GB is still the sweet spot where you aren't frustrated. I do some gaming on here too, mostly when my main phone is charging. It handles high demanding games on high settings surprisingly well. It does get warm, like noticeably warm, if you play for a long session, but it's playable. It's still a beast. Now let's talk about the cameras, because this is where the Pro in iPhone 13 Pro actually starts to show its age, but also its value. You've got a triple 12 megapixel setup here, and I know in a world where the iPhone 17 Pro is rocking triple 48 megapixel sensors, 12 megapixels sounds tiny. You can't crop in as much as you can on newer phones without losing quality. That's just physics. But here's the thing, for posting to Instagram, TikTok, or just sending photos to family, these photos are still excellent, they're sharp, the shutter is fast, and the colors are that classic, reliable iPhone look. And because this is a Pro model, you get features that actually matter if you like to edit. First, ProRAW. If you turn this on, you aren't just taking a picture, you're capturing a massive amount of data. I use this when the lighting is tricky, like a sunset. It lets you go into an editor later and pull back details from the bright skies or dark shadows that would normally be lost. It's a lifesaver and it still works beautifully here. Then there's ProRes video. This is for the people who want the absolute highest fidelity video with less compression. It's amazing that a 4-year-old phone can do this. However, big disclaimer here, ProRes files are absolutely massive, like gigabytes for just a minute of footage. And if you bought the 108 gigabytes model of this phone, remember that Apple limited ProRes to 1080p on that specific model. You need 256 gigabytes or higher to shoot 4K ProRes. And speaking of limits, cinematic mode. This phone launched it and it's still fun. It blurs the background behind your subject like a movie, but on the 13 Pro it is capped at 1080p resolution. Newer iPhones can do this in 4K. Does that matter? If you're watching on a phone screen, probably not. But if you're editing for a bigger project, you might miss that 4K sharpness. So the verdict on the camera, it lacks the crazy resolution and the 8x zoom of the 17 Pro, but for 95% of people, especially with ProRAW, it's still a powerhouse. And then there's Apple Intelligence. This phone doesn't support it. And honestly, for me, it's not a huge deal. You know, Apple Intelligence is still kinda early days, almost like beta software in my opinion. I usually just use alternatives that are more powerful anyway, like Gemini or ChatGPT app, and they run perfectly fine on here. So don't let the lack of Apple Intelligence scare you away. So to wrap this up, the iPhone 13 Pro, 4 years later. For me, this phone is shockingly good by today's standards. With the price dropping so much on the used market, it's honestly a steal if you want that premium Pro experience. 120Hz telephoto lens, premium build without spending a fortune. However, if you are currently using a 13 Pro and you're thinking about upgrading, I think now is the time. Moving to the iPhone 17 Pro is a massive leap. You're going from 12 megapixel cameras to triple 48 megapixel. You're getting that 8x optical quality zoom, 12 gigabytes of RAM. It's a huge upgrade. But if you're on a budget or you just want a solid iPhone that works, handles iOS 26 beautifully and takes great photos, this is it. Maybe ready to swap that battery if it's old. Anyway, that's my take. Thanks for watching and I'll catch you in the next one.